Hi, a couple of weeks back we had put out a video with the tagline a 50 plus year old training for a sub 40 minute 10K. That 50 plus year old person is me. But that's the tagline and the story to go with the set of videos. The main objective of these videos being to discuss about, to analyze, to talk about the concepts that could be used. We are using running as an example, but we can broaden this and say for the topic of conditioning. I'm a strength and conditioning coach, and I work with athletes from various sports: athletics, cricket, mixed martial arts, basketball, hockey, and such. And I also work with non-athletes. So I think the topic of cardio training or conditioning training is applicable to everyone. It's different, specific to which sport the athlete is participating in, or in the case of non-athletes, we have to see how much of conditioning training and is to be imparted to the trainee, and what really are the goals of the conditioning training. But these concepts generally apply to, to the field of conditioning in general. And we are just taking running as an example and training myself for running a sub 40 10K is yet another example. So we're going to use that, and in the course of doing that, discussing about one, the concepts of sports science that could be applied in the field of conditioning training, and number two is what kind of devices could we use. Could we do this without the devices? When we say devices, we are talking of the heart rate monitor or the smartwatch, the lactate meter, devices like that, and how they could be helpful to us. Could we train without them? So on and so forth. Yeah. So today we are going to pick up on the topic of aerobic base building, and we are going to talk about the topic and around the topic. I've prepared a rough PowerPoint, so it gives us a little bit more structure into what we are talking about. So if I look away and from the screen, it means that I'm looking at the laptop and at the PowerPoint presentation. So let's get started. Today we're going to be talking about the concept of aerobic base building. Now, what I've seen is, my personal experience has been that coaches of various sports get their athletes to work hard and harder and harder and harder and harder. My experience has been, I have never actually seen coaches, be it in athletics or from any other sports, cricket, mixed martial arts, I've never seen sports coaches emphasize in the area of aerobic base building, which means the athletes or the non-athletes are training at a very low intensity. And these has several benefits. In fact, the gurus of running and cycling and endurance sports, triathlon, they basically advise that about 80% of the workouts happen in the aerobic zone, which is the low intensity zones, and about 20% of the remaining work happen at higher intensities. We now look at what these zones are. We look at what are the energy systems in play. We look at how we could use some of the devices we had talked about to identify, understand these concepts, and to apply these concepts towards maximizing our training and to achieve the goals that we've set towards our training. So let's get deeper into that. So aerobic training is, we are training at an intensity where we are able to take in enough oxygen. And at higher intensities, our body needs to produce energy quickly, which is fairly obvious. Then the aerobic system is not that much helpful. I mean, it's still working, but in order to produce energy at higher intensities, then we need to look at our anaerobic systems to produce energy with help from the aerobic system. But for activities that are low in intensity, the aerobic system is able to produce plenty of energy. In fact, it produces a lot of energy, but is not able to produce it quickly. So, by the fact that, I mean, when we say that we need to take in enough, we are able to take in enough, the intensity is low enough that we are able to take in enough oxygen, and also that our body is able to process this oxygen efficiently. And what we mean by this, we will get into in further slides. Very briefly to touch upon energy systems, and just the discussion about energy systems itself might be, you could just go on and on about them, but very briefly to touch upon them, the anaerobic alactic is on one end of the scale. This is the maximal intensity effort, such as running 100 meters, and it gets over in what, like less than 10 seconds or maybe 15-20 seconds, depending upon the level and skill of the athlete. And it happens so quickly that the aerobic system will not be able to provide energy quickly enough, so therefore it's anaerobic. And also that it gets over so quickly that there is no chance for lactate to be produced and accumulated in the body, and therefore it's alactic. On the other end of the scale, what we just talked about, aerobic alactic, it is so low in intensity that lactate gets produced. In fact, even when we are at rest, lactate does get produced, but our body processes the lactate and gets rid of it. It doesn't allow accumulation of lactate. The aerobic zone is like a little bit, zone 2 is a little bit higher than that. We'll again look at what are the classification of the different zones, training zones, shortly. So there is no accumulation of, since there is no accumulation of lactate, it's an alactic system and it's aerobic in nature. So the intensity is low enough, like we just talked about, there is enough oxygen, although in the whole process, the aerobic process, at the very end almost, is when the electron transport chain process. One of the steps in that is what uses oxygen. Oxygen is not required throughout the whole process, but just in that final portion of the energy system. But nevertheless, oxygen is required. And at low intensities, like we just discussed, it produces a lot of energy, but it cannot produce energy quickly. For producing energy in a quick manner, then we need to look at our anaerobic energy systems. And in the middle lies the anaerobic lactic. So it is anaerobic. So we are looking into our anaerobic energy systems to produce energy. And it happens long enough that lactate is produced. Up to a certain point, it doesn't accumulate. It starts to accumulate, but not at on a logarithmic scale. But beyond a certain point, it starts to accumulate real fast. And when we say beyond a certain point, we are talking about the activity or the workout intensity. So a 3000 meter run is long enough and intense enough that lactate will be produced and will start to accumulate, as will a 5000 meter run or a 10K run, for example. So they are high to medium intensity. They are also known as the glycolytic system, and they are in between the aerobic alactic, which is very low intensity, and the anaerobic alactic, which is maximal intensity. And the anaerobic lactic system lies in between, and it's high to medium intensity. When we talk about the energy systems, it must be mentioned that it's not like just one of those systems are on. All three are functioning, but which is the primary energy system that is being used to produce energy at any given point in time is what we are talking about. The aerobic system is like a base upon which the anaerobic systems function. One of the reasons for this is when we are looking to our anaerobic energy systems to produce energy by increasing the intensity of the activity or exercise, then our fast twitch muscles kind of take over and they produce lactate. Our skeletal muscles, they produce lactate that is then move to the slow twitch muscle fibers, which are primarily used by our aerobic system. And these slow twitch muscle fibers, the mitochondria in these slow twitch muscle fibers, mitochondria, as we know, are the energy factories in our cells. And these mitochondria in the slow twitch muscle fibers then process the lactate. Lactate is a very preferred substrate for producing energy, even more so than carbohydrates. And in fact, the cardiac muscle and the brain can also use lactate. So the slow twitch muscle fibers and their mitochondria then process the lactate and get rid of, prevent any accumulation of lactate. Now, the more efficient this aerobic base is, the more intense the activity can be until the accumulation starts to happen. So that is why we call this the aerobic base. And in fact, like we just talked earlier, the experts advise that 80% of the work be done in the aerobic zone and about 20% of the work be done in higher zones. And what are the advantages of working a lot in the aerobic zone or in zone 2? We will see in the subsequent slides. These are the training zones. Again, the classification, the nomenclature, and what are the criteria used to identify these zones are different. We have a 7-zone system, we have a 6-zone system. Our smartwatches have their own zones, but we are here going to look at 5 zones, and we are also going to just talk about zone 6 as well. Zone 1 is the low intensity, 50 to 60% of maximum heart rate, which is recovery and easy. So while at rest and there is no significant activity happening, that's zone 1. Zone 2 is 60 to 70% of maximum heart rate. That is the aerobic base building zone that we just talked about. So that's the zone 2 intensity. Zone 3, zone 4, 70 to 80%, 80 to 90% tempo and lactate threshold. The lactate threshold is basically the tipping point where the lactate rises, and then beyond the tipping point it rises real fast. And beyond the lactate threshold, about 5 to 10 to 15 minutes maximum amount of, duration of work can be done at that intensity. And then we'll talk about how much work can be done, what are the areas under the lactate threshold, and even before that in subsequent slides. But zone 5 is like 90 to 100% of maximum heart rate, and we work out in that zone to better our maximum VO2. Now 100 meters maximal effort runs are probably going to be termed as zone 6 then. Yeah. So maximum HR is one way of identifying, and even with people who are using maximum heart rate, I've seen the numbers slightly differ, but yeah, people use percentage of maximum VO2 as well. So this is regarding the zones, and yeah, this is the other thing that I wanted to talk about. How do we identify maximum heart rate if we are going to be using maximum heart rate? We can use our smartwatch and work out at that intensities. Now, the most accurate identification of these zones would happen in a sports science lab, but not all of us have access to sports science labs, and even among elite athletes, they don't have access to sports science labs all the time. So our smartwatch or our heart rate monitor could be used, and when we do really intense exercise, such as when we are trying to maximize our max VO2, or even when we are trying out 100 meters effort, then the smartwatch or the heart rate monitor can give us our maximum heart rate and also our minimum heart rate, isn't it? While at rest, while we sleep, if we are wearing the smartwatch or the ring, for instance, smart ring such as the Aura ring, others are coming out with smart rings as well. So we are able to then identify our maximum HR, our resting heart rate, and then come up with the heart rate reserve and so on and so forth. And with that, we can then identify our training zones as well. So what are the advantages of training in the aerobic zone or in the zone 2 intensities? One is increase of mitochondrial density. So when we increase mitochondrial density, the number of mitochondria increases, they become more efficient, and they also get closer to the uh, cell wall, so that they are able to then grab the ingredients and oxygen off the blood in a more efficient manner. So therefore the density of the mitochondria is increased and their efficiency also increases, and therefore we are able to produce more energy quickly. Myoglobin are these proteins that are present in muscle tissue, which then stores and transports oxygen, and with an increase in myoglobin, then we are able to once again produce more ATP. ATP is the energy currency. We are able to produce more energy quickly. Angiogenesis is the increase in capillary density, and capillaries are like, if we take oxygenated blood that is pumped out of the heart and via arteries, it reaches the tissues in our body, and at that point the capillaries act as a go-between the arteries and the tissues, and there is an exchange of oxygen to the tissues and an exchange back of carbon dioxide, which through the capillaries, which are then transferred to the veins, which then take that deoxygenated blood back to the heart, which then enters the pulmonary circulation, and that blood gets oxygenated, and through the arteries the heart then pumps the oxygenated blood to the muscle tissue. So this is the circulatory system. So an increase in capillary density helps in more efficiently getting the oxygen that's present in the blood, and so that way we can then produce more energy quickly. Hormonal adaptation: when we work at low intensities, less cortisol is produced. In some instances, it's been found that cortisol is lowered working in these lower intensities. And as we know, accumulation of cortisol, especially in a chronic manner, is not a good thing. Cortisol is a catabolic hormone, and once again, it's not good to have a chronic accumulation of increase of cortisol in our body. It's never a good thing. And sometimes the not only the intensity, we've always talked about intensity and what it of the activity or the exercise and what it does in our body so far, the lactate accumulation, then the cortisol, the increase in heart rate, things like that. But yet another factor in there, maybe the x-axis is the intensity, the y-axis is the lactate or the increase in heart rate or the amount of cortisol. But then there is yet another factor, maybe the z-axis or the z-axis, which should really talk about duration as well. So maybe at a certain intensity of exercise, lactate does not build up for up to, let's say, for as an example, 30 minutes. But then if we drift from 30 to 45 minutes or perhaps more than that, then there is a cardiac drift. So the heart rate increases, the lactate probably goes up in the blood lactate amount goes up, so on and so forth. So that's another factor that one needs to keep in mind when we plan training for our athletes and even for our non-athletes. Fat as a fuel. At lower intensities, our body is able to use fat as fuel. Fat is more energy dense, as we know, than is carbohydrate. And our body is metabolically flexible, so to speak, to either use fat or carbohydrates for fuel. Now, in people who have metabolic disorders such as diabetes, they are not so efficient at using fat as fuel. One of the reasons being that there is an overload of insulin running around in the body for type 2 diabetic people, and insulin does not inhibits lipolysis. So fat is not being our body is unable to use fat as fuel in the presence of a lot of insulin. So that's one of the reasons to keep working in the aerobic zone, to get our body metabolically flexible so that we are able to use fat as fuel. Now, this could also be used to reduce excess body fat, body weight. And as we will see later on, the longer the duration, more fat is also being used as fuel at lower intensities. Reduced risk of injury, that's kind of self-evident, because working at lower intensities, there is less risk of injury to the body. Reduced risk of overtraining. Now, working at higher intensities need more recovery time and effort, but working at lower intensities does not require specific recovery efforts. And in fact, working at, as we will see in the next bullet point, working at these aerobic intensities is used to increase recoveries. And drifting right into that point, so if we are talking about an interval session where we are having 4 minutes of high intensity exercise, followed by 2, 3, 4 minutes of recovery, then doing activity in the aerobic zone is better. So that's called an active recovery rather than a passive recovery where the person is sitting, standing, or just lying on the ground. So doing some activity in the lower intensities in the aerobic zone, zone 2, zone 1, is much better for recovery and is known as active recovery than passive recoveries where the person is just resting completely.